senior personnel on the grant that's funding the undergraduate research projects associated with this big data. And the talk that I'm going to give is not going to be my research talk, all right? So I'm going to speak for just a couple moments about what I do research-wise, but then as I look through the schedule of what you've already done and talked to something, it seems like nobody had really given you any just general advice about managing data and looking at data yet, and I thought I would do that. Okay. So my name is Greg Smith. I'm in the Applied Science Department. I've been here for about 13 years, and my training is a little unusual. I started out in an engineering school majoring in molecular biology. So from the beginning, I sort of had interests in biology, as well as I had pretty good physical science education because I was at engineering school. I was going to be pre-med, and at the last minute I decided I didn't want to do that. And I taught high school for a couple years, didn't really like that. Decided, I realized at some point that I was spending all my evenings reading about math and science, and I thought that maybe I should go to graduate school if I was going to do that. And when I got in, I ended up getting into a biophysics program at UC Davis, and that seemed to make sense just because it was a combination of biology and something quantitative. It turned out I was really not very good at the experimental work that was required, so we were doing lab rotations, and I was pretty unhappy in my first year of graduate school because of the practicums, essentially. I wasn't very dexterous. I kind of would get bored in the lab. But I was excelling, doing very well in my theoretical physical chemistry classes, and in fact I was doing better or as good as the PhD physical chemists who were there training to get their PhD in physical chemistry. And so I kind of realized that I was probably meant to be a theorist of some kind, and I started asking people whether there was any, the sort of theoretical physical chemistry. Is there anything called, like physical biology or theoretical biophysics or theoretical cell biology or something like that? And the people in my advisor was sort of said, and there isn't really a field of theoretical cell biology, but there is a person who's working in that area on campus, and I went to meet him and fell in love, basically, and decided I wanted to learn everything he knew how to do. I chose him as my advisor, and from that point on, everything was a cakewalk, basically. So I finally found my niche. So, what I do in my lab is essentially developing biophysical theory that helps with the understanding that physiologists have, cell physiologists, of cell signaling, right? So there's sort of two general areas: the function of the heart. So this is cardiac myocytes, heart muscle tissue, as well as the function of the brain. Both cell types, neurons and heart muscle cells, are electrically excitable, and they have very interesting nonlinear membrane properties, and it's these that cause them to be able to signal one another or to coordinate things like contraction. And that's my expertise, is the mathematical description of sort of electrical and biochemical events in living cells. So if you're interested more in that sort of thing, you just probably look at my webpage and look at some of the papers that I've written, and you'll see the sort of thing that we're doing. It's often reaction diffusion equations or some sort of stochastic modeling of problems that are of interest to molecular cell biologists and neuroscientists. You guys are quiet. So any questions about my research? Intro? Meaning of life? No. And so how many people know what MATLAB is and have used MATLAB? Most of you? Okay. So this lecture is not going to really be an introduction to MATLAB, but it's sort of a philosophy that I have about how to read math books, how to learn theoretical topics. And so I chose, because I'm not really a big data person, I chose this title, Visual and Virtual Data. Right? And you'll see what I mean by both of those in a bit. And we're probably going to focus on the visual, because I don't think we're going to get all the way to what I expect to do, but I might come back and finish up. So this is something that I read last week in a book I was reading. And sort of words sort of flashed across the page. I was reading the book relatively quickly, and it said, the special orthogonal matrices, SO2, can be represented as a single parameter curve in R4. Okay. So this is, are a number of, anyone math majors here? Oh, yeah. So is this like obvious to everyone? Right? Okay, so if you're a math major, right, and you're reading a math book, and something like this is said, and your tendency would be to just sort of keep going, right? Right? But I mean, if the person who's writing this book thinks that is somehow obvious, it's probably obvious to them because they've thought about it for a really long time, right? I mean, they might actually be group theorists or something, and all they do is think about groups. And groups can be represented often as collections of matrices and how they interact with one another. But when I read something like this, I have a very applied training, and I just kind of, if I can't visualize it, if I don't really understand kind of in a pictorial way, graphical way, what's happening, I'm not going to really get it at all. And so that's, maybe a disadvantage that I don't have that pure mathematics training in my background, but I'm a pretty good applied mathematician and coder, okay? I'm pretty fast coding things up, and I'm very familiar with certain software packages, like MATLAB is an interpreted programming language. And so I could basically try to figure out what's going on with a statement like this really quickly by just sort of setting my book aside, sketching something out on a piece of paper, and then coding it up. All right? So if I were going to do that here, what do you imagine I would try to do? So you're reading this book, and we have no idea what this means, right? It's really hard to understand what it means. Do we know what R4 is? So R4 is the Cartesian coordinate system with 4 dimensions, right? Okay, so we got that part. A single parameter curve in R4, that means that there's some number like time or something, and there's some curve going around in that 4-dimensional space. And then do we know what an orthogonal matrix is? Can someone remind me about that?
Isn't an orthogonal matrix when you do A transpose A, you get the identity matrix?
Exactly. Okay. So an orthogonal matrix, Q transpose Q is the identity. And these are 2 by 2 matrices, it says, right? So this would be saying that AB, CD equals 1, 1, 0, 0. And then the transpose of this is A, D, C, B. Okay? And you can do the matrix multiplication and come up with a set of equations, right, that have to be satisfied by these 4 numbers. And when you do, you'd find out that there really is only one free parameter. Okay? So we figured out that much, that there is this one-dimensional representation of somehow. But what does this curve look like? Like, what are they talking about? And the easiest way to do that is to just open up MATLAB and let's see, I'm going to grab my glasses here. And they're not here. There they go. Okay, so I'll just squint, and one of these file open. One of these is what I did. I wrote this little MATLAB script, took me about, probably took me 2 to 5 minutes. Is that big enough? Nah. Is there an easy way for me to make these all larger? You think the magnifying glasses would do it right? MATLAB, preferences, fonts, and maybe this is it. Ta-da. See, I'm really good at computers. So this is what I coded up. M was meant to be the dimension of the matrix. I was thinking that maybe this would generalize somehow, so I wrote it that way. I ended up meeting a variable called tolerance that you'll see later. N is going to be a number of trials. Okay? So what I decided to do was something that's just really, really basic kind of idea, is that I'm going to just randomly pick 4 numbers. Right? I'm going to put them in a matrix, and I'm going to just ask MATLAB to tell me whether or not it's close to orthogonal, right? So this is basically the number of matrices I'm going to try to generate. There's a while loop here, okay? I'm going to pick this random 2 by 2 matrix, and then the if statement is saying that the norm of A times A prime minus the identity must be less than this tolerance. And then I learned that it's also good to make sure the determinant is positive, all right? Because otherwise you get two curves, right? So, and then what I'm doing is, if this is true, I'm taking the 2 by 2 matrix and reshaping it so that it's 1 by 4, right? And then I'm adding that as the next row in this matrix called QQ. And whenever I double something, it's my way of remembering that this thing is a matrix of, or a vector of something else. Okay? So this is a list of Q matrices, right? And then I count, okay? And then when I'm done, I've got this long list of 100 different almost orthogonal matrices, and I'm going to plot in the 3-dimensional space the first 3 coordinates and see what it looks like. So if this works, worked last week. It seems to not be struggling too hard to find matrices that are almost orthogonal. And now it's plotted them. And you can sort of see that it, in the 3-dimensional space, it kind of looks like a ring. And it's easy to, on these plots, you can rotate the view. Okay? So it's looking like at least the projection from 4-dimensional space into 3-dimensional space is leading to a ring. Okay? Now, I found out that if I try to increase the tolerance, right, it actually takes a little bit too long to find these matrices. So I read a little bit of MATLAB sort of documentation and found that if I just pick any matrix and then run this command orth, MATLAB is going to come up with an orthogonal matrix that spans the same space. So let me comment this out, edit, it's a text comment. Is that going to work?
You have to tab the lower portion.
Sorry?
I don't know how MATLAb's like space.
MATLAB, any language that cares how much white space there is not to be used. That's a good observation, but it's in Fortran or something it might matter, but.
Okay, so Python does, MATLAB.
A good observation, but I don't think it matters. So let's see if it runs. Okay, there's 100, right? And what's great about this is it's so fast now. I can do 1,000. Okay, and you see that nice little tight ring the scatter that we saw before isn't there. Now, it's four-dimensional, and we kind of need to understand what's going on in that other dimension, and that's a little hard. I was going to show you how you could use MATLAB to color this line so that the color represents what's going on in the other dimension, but I ran out of time. Okay? But what I could do is, on this line, I'm basically going to take a set of indices whenever the fourth dimension is between minus 0.1 and 1. All the other ones went from minus 1 to 1. So whenever we're in this sort of 10% region in the middle of the fourth coordinate, we're going to plot that one, again, a different color. And you can see it there. So that was a little surprising, right? In one coordinate, we're only spanning like 10% of the space, and yet it's half of this ring, right? It's covered. But if you look at this and rotate it and think about the different axes and and its conditions that you worked out quickly by hand, you start to get a sense of what's going on. Right? So it's a four-dimensional ring. What do you guys? You're a statistician. There's nobody here I can ask. It's homeomorphic to the circle, right? That's what a topologist would say, I think. Right? But it's in four-dimensional space, and you can see it there. I think if you projected it down to 2, you'd still get a circle, right? Okay, so what did I do? We've got to go back to note. So that's the way I do mathematics. When I read something and I don't understand it, very often I'm good enough at programming things up, just coding things up quickly, that I can make some sort of graph or some sort of picture and really understand what's going on. Right? I do that all the time, and I almost never read math books unless I've got MATLAB running, okay, on the side. So what I did was I used MATLAB. Okay, so now this was a long time ago when I read this. The normal approximation to the binomial distribution, well, everyone's talking about that. It's like, yeah, I've heard that, that makes sense, right? And then I searched to figure out what that meant, and I got this equation. So it looks like on the left-hand side, this is a combinatorial coefficient. This is the binomial distribution. P and Q are between 0 and 1, and Q is 1 minus P. And then over here is a Gaussian function where P and Q and N are parameters. Okay? And this little squiggle here means that the two expressions are asymptotically related to one another. Right? So in some limit, these two will get closer and closer together. And that symbol sort of puts in the background some important stuff about how quickly it's converging and so on. Right? So what did I do? I read this and I didn't think I really understood it. This was 10 years ago. Okay? If I really understand that, what would you do?
Use MATLAB.
Use MATLAB. Right? How hard is it to plot this function, right? How hard is it to plot that function? The only thing that's a little rough is that this is discrete, right? And this is continuous. And so you're going to have to fuss a little bit with your programming to make sure that that works out right. But that's actually that's really important, right? When you're saying that a discrete distribution and a continuous distribution are converging somehow, you're going to have to be really clear about what you mean in terms of how you relate a discrete and continuous distribution, right? So just the process of coding this up is going to let me see the convergence. I'll be able to play with what parameters need to be large or small in order for the two to look similar, right? And this thing that I couldn't get about how do you compare a discrete and a continuous distribution in the best way, I can work all that out by coding this up. Now, when I did this is actually something that I've used in classes. I'm not going to walk through the code, but there is the little piece of code. It doesn't take that long to sort of figure out how to do it. There's a binomial distribution where P is 0.5, so Q is 0.5, and N is 10. And then plotted on top of that is the Gaussian with the appropriate parameters using P and N. can sort of see that expression in MATLAB is sort of sitting here. Now, I had to figure out what was the right variance to use here, right? I had to think about, was it going to matter whether I evaluated the Gaussian at the particular point or whether I integrated over a little bin that was the same relative size as the histogram, right? There's two slightly different answers. Turns out it doesn't really matter in the end when you get up to say 100 here. You can totally see that you're getting almost exactly the same answer. Okay? Another thing that you notice when you play around here is MATLAB is actually, when it's building this histogram, it's essentially scaling it so that it's going from 0 to n is always the same distance because it's got to fit it on the screen, right? When you make these distributions for larger and larger values of n, right, they actually end up getting narrower in this relative sense. And that ends up being a really important fact that connects to certain things in thermodynamics and statistical physics, right? That when you take a Gaussian and you scale it so that this dimension is always sort of the Gaussian goes to infinity, but if you scale it so the length between 0 and like between different, if you scaled it so that having all of your coins landing heads and all of the coins landing tails, that's always the same dimension from 0 to 1, the actual variance here is going to decrease relative to that size. Sort of like if you flip 10 coins, it might be fairly likely that you'll get 7 heads, right? But if you flipped 10 million coins, you're never going to get 7 million heads. It's never going to happen. And I should probably say 4 more. All right, so what did I do? I used MATLAB to just help me understand what was going on. Now, one of the things that I do a lot of is stochastic processes. So in cell physiology, there are what are called microdomains in cells. There's small regions that are often membrane delimited, or there's molecular crowding, so that signaling is happening in a really small volume within a cell. And because there's a small number of molecules, stochastic effects start to matter, right? You have to model things using some sort of probability model as opposed to just deterministic equations. And this would be an example of this is just an illustration, the phenomenon of Brownian motion in like 1905 or something like that. No, maybe a little bit earlier. I think Brown was actually maybe around the Civil War time. Just made the observation that if you put pollen, right, in water and you look at it under a microscope, it sort of jiggles around. Okay? And it turns out that there was really no explanation for why that was happening at the time. At that time, around the Civil War, people didn't know, they didn't really have a sense of the sort of discrete nature of matter, right? There wasn't an atomic sort of theory. The way physicists thought about the universe was more continuous at that point. And in that perspective, there's really no understanding why this molecule would move around in an erratic path. But Einstein, in 1905 or something like that, one of the first things that he did that was really significant is he makes this major contribution to physical chemistry and biology, actually. He's not mostly known for this, right? But he wrote a wonderful paper explaining where, the origin of Brownian motion. And what's essentially happening is that there's a finite number of water molecules close to the pollen. And as they bounce against it, there are periods of time where the forces are not matching in every direction, and so the molecule, the larger object, shifts position, right? So you can actually you can take the actual physical measurement of Brownian motion. Okay, how quickly is that particle moving, right? And in an average sense, and use that information to calculate Avogadro's number. And that was actually done to like 10% precision or something by a physical chemist around that time, 1910. Okay. So you can, it's actually pretty amazing. It's like you can prove to yourself that they're really, that matter is really, that there are particles, right? That there are subatomic particles. It's really hard to show that in any other way. Okay, so the random walk model for Brownian motion is to just say that a particle is initially at the origin, we're going to have a one-dimensional walk, and some time step later, the particle will be at a position that's given by its old position plus a normally distributed random number that has mean zero and variance delta t. Okay? So you can put this in a computer, right, and run it over and over again and have a little model for Brownian motion diffusion. And what you'll read in the textbooks are that the average value for this, for the displacement of the particle as a function of time is always zero, right? And that the average square value for the displacement is proportional to time. Okay? You'll read that and you'll gloss over it and you won't really understand what it means or why it's true. But if you code it up in MATLAB, right, you can actually see it happening. Right? So this one is a little more involved. This might take you a couple hours to code up. Brownian. Okay, so here I'm going to do one particle. So you see that particle sort of moving around doing its random walk? And this is the displacement of the particle as a function of time. Right? But now let's do something like 100. And now we start to see, this is the average position of all the particles as a function of time, which is 0. And this is the variance of the position as a function of time across all of the particles. And it looks like it's almost linear. And as the, if we increase this even more, say 1,000, that's still pretty fast if you do this right. Okay? You start seeing, you hear about Gaussians, right, in terms of as the kernel of the heat equation and stuff like that. This is coming about from these, this sort of convergence that happens as there's more and more particles. So we know now that this is, this is almost like a binomial distribution, but it's going to converge to the Gaussian in the limit where the number of particles goes to infinity, and this really is a straight line. And then the hard part is fussing with what is the slope exactly here, and how is that related to the time step that you're taking, right? How is that related to, in a continuous problem, the actual the parameter that's called the diffusion coefficient, right? There's a little bit of, you really got to think about things and pay attention to detail to get that part right. But coding this thing up doesn't take long at all if you're good at that sort of thing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is the red line the variance or the square of the variance?
It's the variance.
Didn't you say it was like the square of, or is variance the square of standard deviation? I forget, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, so it's the square of the displacement
Okay.
averaged over the ensemble that's proportional to t. And I'm calling this variance. It's really the second moment, right? But the average is 0, so they end up being the same thing. You can work that out. Okay. So this is the variance because the mean is 0. Did that answer your question? All right. Next one. I read this recently. I was reading something and it just said, everyone knows the volume of a 4-dimensional ball, right? And R4 is, and it gave me something, right? And I was just like, I'm not even sure I know what that means, right? Okay, so what did I do?
MATLAB.
Wrong. Okay, didn't do MATLAB, right? Because I didn't really understand. I wasn't sure how I would code this up. All right. What I did was I thought of a simpler problem that I could code up in MATLAB because I needed to get oriented. Right. I needed to think of a way that I can actually calculate the area of this thing, right, or the volume of this thing. In MATLAB, and I'm not going to use MATLAB to calculate some kind of integral or something. If I'm going to do it that way, I'll do it by hand. I'll do it analytically, right? So what you can come up with, if I think this comes up pretty, this is pretty natural, is if you have a square box like this that's a certain size, let's call this halfway across R, right? Then if I pick a random point, x comma y, right, in here, and I'm uniformly distributed for both x and y, okay, then there's no reason why this point should prefer to be in any place across the square, right? It's sort of spatially uniformly distributed. So they'll be, in some sense, evenly distributed across the square. But it's easy to just ask the question for any one of these random points whether that's true. Okay? And if it is, we'll just click a counter, right? And every time we do it, we'll click another counter. And then we'll take the ratio of those two counters, and it ought to be something like the ratio between the area of the circle and the area of the square. Does that make sense? So this is called Monte Carlo integration, sort of poor man's Monte Carlo integration. And here's an example. So if you can believe it, I'm using MATLAB to figure out the area of a circle. File, open, area circle. How many points? Let's use 100 points. The D here is 2 dimensions. This is actually the second version of my code. I figured out how to generalize that to higher dimensions. And let's just run it here. So that's 100 points, and the green ones are inside the circle, and the red ones are outside. Right? The answer that we're getting for this square, which is radius 1, is 3.28, and the actual area is pi times the radius squared, and since the r is 1, we should be getting pi. Right? But we're doing pretty well, even with just 100 points. If you try a little harder, make this 10,000 points. Okay, the answer that we're getting is 3.1416. It's like 1 part in 1,000 relative error. Okay, so just like that, I hardly have to think at all. And not only am I'm checking this because I know the answer in this case, right? But now it's pretty obvious how to generalize this. Now I can calculate the volume of a cubical thing, or the volume of something that's 4-dimensional, and so on. So this is the way I'm doing it in a general form. This is producing a bunch of random numbers that are going between -1 and 1, okay? Minus r and positive r, that's what this does.